Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular series of shiurim. Our subject is fun. What do the great rabbis over the centuries have to say about having fun? Is there room in Jewish thought for having fun? We have seen certain specific prohibitions which pertain during Avelos, when people are in mourning, and of course outside of the situation of being in mourning, those activities are of course acceptable. We have seen the approach of the great Hasidic masters, according to whom everything that you do, every action you take, can be directed in a spiritual way if you will only have kavanah, if you only have an intention that what you are doing so that you will be able to better perform Torah and mitzvahs. If you play a game of basketball or enjoy yourself playing chess or whatever it is, so that you will be able to refresh yourself and return to Torah and mitzvot with greater energy and greater vigor, then the basketball or the game of chess becomes part of the enterprise of Torah and mitzvahs, and that's of course good. Now we also saw the idea that in the Beit Knesset, let's see if I can get this beautifully on the screen. Here it goes. Nope. Get this beautifully on the screen. There, we got it. We also saw, and we saw this at the very end of the last shiur, at the very end of the last lesson, we saw that in the Beit Knesset there are certain limitations. The Beit Knesset is a place of solemnity. The Beit Knesset is a place which is intended entirely for spirituality. The Beit Knesset is a place where certain fun activities are prohibited, and we saw this at the end of the previous shiur, that in the Beit Knesset frivolity is prohibited. Schok, hitul, sicha betela, these are prohibited things in the Beit Knesset, frivolous, fun activities. Of course, outside of the Beit Knesset, there's no problem with this, but in the context of the Beit Knesset, where we must demonstrate our kavod, our honor and respect for the spiritual life, within that context, there's no room for frivolity, no room for fun. Now let's see the definition. Now we begin looking at what the great rabbis have to say about the precise definition of exactly what it is that's prohibited in the synagogue. The Olat Tamid, 17th century. Olat Tamid, it's hard to find copies of the Olat Tamid nowadays, even though it's a terribly important sefer. The reason it's not frequently reprinted is because the Magen Avraham, the greatest of all the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, systematically includes the words of the Olat Tamid, and since everyone who has a standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch has the Magen Avraham in it, and the Magen Avraham systematically brings the words of the Olat Tamid, so the sefer by itself is not usually printed anymore. But this is what he has to say on the issue, and this is the opinion which is embraced by subsequent poskim. Kegon schok, what is it that we're supposed to refrain from in the synagogue? What is it that is out of consonance? What is it that is wrong in the synagogue? Hu hadin da'asur lishchot betochan. You're not allowed to slaughter animals in the Beit Knesset. The community needs to slaughter a cow for meat, or they want to slaughter chickens or whatever. You can't do the shchita, the slaughtering, in the Beit Knesset. And then he quotes Rav Shmuel Abuah, one of the great rabbis from the heyday of Tzfat, from the golden days of Tzfat in the early 16th century. Lo yehe yoshev uposhet raglav. When you're sitting in the synagogue, you have to sit correctly. You cannot sit extending your legs in a very, very relaxed way. It's wrong to sit in the Beit Knesset in a very relaxed way. In the Beit Knesset, one must sit correctly, just like, I suppose times have changed, but when I was a boy in school, they always told us that you have to sit in your seat properly, and, well, sitting properly in the Beit Knesset is required. You can't have someone leaning on his arm. You can't put your elbow on the table and lean on your hand. That's not a proper way to sit in the Beit Knesset. And when I was a boy in school, the teacher would be terribly upset if the children would sit that way in the classroom. That's improper. You can't have in the synagogue people walking to and fro. Everyone in the synagogue should go to his place and sit properly. I say his place because in those days there was no such thing as women going to her place. I mean, there was no place in the synagogue for women back in those days. So everyone has to go to his place and sit properly. You can't be walking to and fro. You can't have a conversation with your friends in the Beit Knesset. You can't have anyone diverting his attention from the prayers in the synagogue. You can't divert your attention from the synagogue and deal with other matters in the synagogue, matters which are lo hagunim, lo nechonim. You can only deal with the prayers in the Beit Knesset, and you cannot divert your attention to anything else. That's in the house of the Lord. That's what's required. Now, all of these activities, which are prohibited in the Beit Knesset, are, of course, permitted outside of the context of the sanctity of the Beit Knesset. Therefore, in general, just as we have no objection to shchita, slaughtering animals in the correct way, assuming that we need the meat to eat, just as when you're in the privacy or the privacy of your own home, there's no objection to relaxing and sitting in a relaxed way. There's surely no objection to walking around, and surely no objection to having conversations with your friends. That's outside of the Beit Knesset. All is well. Let's look at what the Mishnah Berurah, I just quoted the Olas Tamid, the great work from the 17th century, which is later embraced by all of the poskim, just to make sure that the great contemporary rabbis are understanding this in the same way. Let's look at the Mishnah Berurah, surely no more influential modern posek than that. The Mishnah Berurah says, Kalas Rosh, the frivolity which is prohibited, Kihem Nikraim Mikdash Ma'at, frivolity is prohibited in the synagogue because the synagogue is like a little Beis HaMikdash, like the temple in Jerusalem was the Beis HaMikdash. That's where God's presence was felt by everyone. And when you're directly in the presence of God, well, one's in the presence of God everywhere, but one senses it more in the Beis HaMikdash in Jerusalem, and one should sense it more in the synagogue when you sense in a more strong way that you're in the presence of God. So, of course, you want to be dealing only with Torah and mitzvah, only with spiritual matters, and not with matters which are frivolous. That's the underlying idea. Et mikdashi tira'u, it says in the verse in the Torah, one must have awe of the Beis HaMikdash. Sheyehe mora'o shalashochem ba'alav. When you are in the Beit HaMikdash, you have to have a sense of awe of the Beit HaMikdash, because that's awe of God, and therefore, Kalas Rosh, frivolity in the Beit Knesset is prohibited. And you know, there's a long history of synagogues being abandoned by Jewish communities. If the community moves from one neighborhood to another, there's a long history of synagogues in the old neighborhood being abandoned, and those buildings which were used for synagogues have no other practical use in the world except as churches, and the old synagogues are typically bought by non-Jewish religions and then used for churches in other religions. And according to the Smak, the Sefer Mitzvahs HaGadol, one of the great Ashkenaz Rishonim, the turning of a synagogue into a church, which is surely not nice, that is a result of the avon, the sin of frivolity in the Beit HaMikdash, in the synagogues. Well, bottom line, according to the poskim, the reason that we do not permit frivolity in the Beit Knesset is the same reason we don't permit it in the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, namely, one must have a sense of the presence of God. Sicha B'Teila, you're not allowed to have an innocent conversation in the synagogue. Namely, afilu sichat chulin, any conversation of a secular nature, shehi l'tzorach parnasa, even if you're talking with your neighbor about your livelihood, you're engaged in some kind of business deal, some kind of business transaction, and you continue the discussion in the synagogue, and it's important for your business, or you meet in the synagogue the manager of your local grocery store, and you want to have a quick business discussion with the manager of the local grocery store. Well, business discussions are prohibited in the synagogue. B'chutz shari, of course, outside the synagogue, there's no objection to that, but in the Beit Knesset, prohibited, especially innocent conversations which have no constructive purpose at all. Friends just get together and exchange words. No particular need for them to do so, unlike business discussions, which there's really a need for it. Friends get together, they exchange words, they have a discussion. No particular need for that conversation. It's an entirely innocent conversation. Bivadai, surely it is correct to avoid that in the Beit Knesset. The Prima Gadim is the source of this idea. The Zohar emphasizes it. Hiflig ma'od. The Zohar emphasized very strongly how great is the sin of idle conversation in the synagogue. Kol yireh v'chared l'dvar Hashem, anyone who has any sense of awe of God in his soul, anyone with any sense of awe of God in his soul will always make an effort not to speak any innocent words in the synagogue. This place, the synagogue, is there specially for Torah and Tefillah, not allowed to do anything else there except Torah and Tefillah in the Beit Knesset. Now, it follows, therefore, that there's not any objection to an innocent conversation between friends outside of the Beit Knesset. We saw last time that the Shulchan Aruch said you're not allowed to eat in there, and we discussed all the exceptions. We discussed how to build a synagogue, how to open a synagogue with an exception built into it to permit eating in there. We discussed this last time, but assuming that no tanai, no condition was made when the synagogue was first opened, you're not allowed to eat there. Not allowed to work in there at all. If you're a carpenter, you can't bring your carpentry work into the synagogue. It doesn't matter what your work is. If you're a programmer, you can't bring your laptop into the synagogue and pound away code on your whatever your malacha, whatever your work is. The synagogue is not a place for your work. It's a place for Torah and Tefillah. The Mishnah Berurah goes so far as to quote the practice of the Arizal, the greatest of the mystics of Tzfat from the beginning of the 16th century. Arizal was nizhar ma'od, was exquisitely careful. Shelo ledaber bebeit hakneset rak tfilato. He was exquisitely careful not to speak a single word in the synagogue except the words of the prayer. Afilu divrei musar lo diber. He would not even make a drasha. It's quite common for rabbis to make drashot, sermons in the synagogue, in order to encourage the people to be more careful with Torah and mitzvot, in order to instruct the people how to be careful with Torah and mitzvot, in order to instruct the people how they can understand Torah even better. Almost every shul has a rabbi which is giving regular sermons for obviously constructive purposes. The Arizal never did that in the Beit Knesset. If he wanted to give a sermon, he made arrangements to do it someplace outside the Beit Knesset. In the Beit Knesset, not a single word would escape his mouth except the words of the prayers. Pen yimashech mimenu divreicho. He was afraid that if he would begin speaking about other matters in the Beit Knesset, even if he would begin speaking about Torah matters, Mussar matters, important Torah, spiritual, he was afraid even if he would begin speaking about spiritual matters in the Beit Knesset, once he starts talking, so he's going to say other things of an innocent nature. He didn't want to come close to saying anything of an innocent nature in the Beit Knesset. Mishnah Berurah goes on and says, what about the word asuta? When people sneeze, people surrounding the person who sneezes often say in Yiddish, Gesundheit. Gesundheit is just a Yiddish word for health, a little prayer that you should be healthy. In Hebrew today, in Israel, if you hear someone sneeze, people usually who hear someone sneeze will say in Hebrew, livriut, using the Hebrew word briut for health, a little prayer that the person who sneezed should be healthy. In Aramaic, in the language of the Gemara, asuta is the word for health, and therefore the question arises: what happens if you hear someone sneeze in the synagogue, in the Beit Knesset? Is it correct to say asuta in Aramaic, or Gesundheit in Yiddish, or Livriut in Hebrew? Are these little blessings correct? Well, Ein lizalzel la'adam b'beit ha'knesset mipnei shemizalzel b'chvod hashchina. It's okay to say something like that in the Beit Knesset because you don't want to run the risk of insulting someone. If someone sneezes and his neighbor fails to say Gesundheit, or fails to say asuta, livriut, or whatever the correct blessing is in whatever country you happen to be in at the moment, if the neighbor fails to say that, that's an insult. It's like we're ignoring him, we're disregarding him, and we surely don't want to insult anyone in the Beit Knesset, and therefore it should be okay to say that. On the other hand, other Sfarim, namely the Ateret Zkenim, say someone who sneezes in the Beit Knesset, we do not say to him, Refuah, Gesundheit, because that is not part of the regular prayers. It isn't like a little prayer, I hope you'll be healthy, but it's not part of the standard prayers, and even that is prohibited, according to some poskim, in the Beit Knesset. Ata'iyanti, now I've looked into the matter, the Mishnah Berurah says, after quoting diverse opinions, those who approve of Gesundheit in the synagogue and those who oppose Gesundheit in the synagogue. Now the Mishnah Berurah says, Ata'iyanti, I've looked into the matter, V'lo matzati heichanhu b'maimuni. I can't find the source for those who wish to prohibit Gesundheit in the synagogue. I can't find the source for it. Adrabah, on the contrary, I do find that it says regarding the Beit HaMidrash, that's the learning center as opposed to the prayer center, I did find a source which prohibits Gesundheit in the learning center, in the Beit HaMidrash, implying that in the Beit Knesset, it's fine. Bottom line, the Mishnah Berurah has no problem with being polite in the Beit Knesset, although innocent speech unrelated to Torah and mitzvahs should be avoided in the Beit Knesset. Being polite, avoiding insulting someone, that's okay. HaKadosh Baruch Hu surely doesn't want us to insult people. the Pri Megadim, in his commentary in the back of the Shulchan Aruch, is also very exercised about the question of Gesundheit in the synagogue. He says, Shel Beit Rabban Gamliel lo hayu omrim mirpa beveit midrash. Back in the days of Rabban Gamliel, when he was in charge of the centers of learning in Eretz Israel, he did not allow people to say Gesundheit, or back in those days they said mirpa, not allowed to wish someone health if they sneeze in the Beis HaMidrash, in the center of learning. Mipnei bitul Beis HaMidrash, because that means diverting yourself a moment from learning. In the Beis HaMidrash, where people are there to be learning Torah, you're supposed to be immersed in the learning that you do. You have your Gemara open, you have your Chumash open, Rashi, whatever it is that you're learning in the Beis HaMidrash requires total concentration and total immersion, and therefore in the Beis HaMidrash, where total concentration and total immersion is required on the, whatever it is you're learning, whether it's Gemara or Rashi or whatever it is, of course it's wrong to have your attention diverted to someone who sneezes and say Gesundheit. Ein lomar b'Beit HaKnesset sharo, ela yesh lomar b'Beis HaMidrash l'chatchila shari, kol mashmalan da'asa, kol shekain b'Beit HaKnesset. Well, according to the Pri Megadim, if Rabban Gamliel was unhappy with people diverting their attention from learning in the Beis HaMidrash, because that's a place which requires total concentration on the learning, similarly, in the Beit Knesset is a place which requires total concentration on standing before God in prayer, sitting before God in prayer, being in God's presence in prayer. One's total concentration is required. And therefore, of course, one should not even say Gesundheit to someone else. One should concentrate entirely on what's proper. Okay, well, what have we seen? Yeah, of course it's a good idea to wish someone health, and it does indeed go back to Torah sources. And of course it's correct. Of course it's correct and proper, just not in the context of the synagogue where one's attention is supposed to be totally focused on God, not in the Beis HaMidrash where one's focus is supposed to be entirely 100% on the learning that you are doing. Let's understand for a moment what's going on here. The idea of Beit Knesset, the idea underlying the synagogue, is the idea of kavod, honor, respect, dignity. Kavod, honor, respect, dignity is what it's all about. We don't want to do anything which would be a zilzul, a disregard, a disrespect of the synagogue, a dishonoring of the synagogue. We don't want zilzul. We don't want disrespect, dishonoring, not zilzul. We want kavod, honor, respect, and dignity. The underlying concept of kavod, the chol haTorah kula, the underlying concept of honor, respect, dignity, kavod, throughout the length and breadth of Torah is tzumet halev, paying attention. Paying attention is the expression of kavod. If someone is speaking, the way to honor him, the way to honor her, is by paying attention to the words. If the Sefer Torah is being read, the way to honor the reading of the Sefer Torah is to pay attention to the words. It's paying attention which underlies the idea of kavod, underlies the idea of honor, dignity, and respect. And the Beit Knesset is a place which demands kavod, demands honor, dignity, and respect, and therefore what is required is paying attention, focusing one's attention on the spiritual aspects of the synagogue and not allowing one's attention to be diverted to anything else. Indeed. Of course, it's correct to say anything in the Beit Knesset which will help someone with the prayers. Someone wants to know what to do because they left out Ya'aleh v'Yavo. So of course it's correct to tell them, because now you are focusing on the prayers by telling them what to do. If they forgot to say Ya'aleh v'Yavo, if someone doesn't know where we're holding in reading of the Torah, and you say, we're on chapter such and such, verse such and such, well, that's a focusing of the attention on Kriyat HaTorah, and that's entirely correct. But according to the sources we've seen, it's incorrect to make an announcement about what time the youth group is going to meet on Wednesday. Making an announcement about what time the youth group is going to meet on Wednesday, that's frivolous talk in the Beit Knesset. The Arizal would never have allowed those words to come out of his mouth. That is somehow contrary to the honor, dignity, and respect of the Beit Knesset, because you're no longer focusing on the spirituality of the Beit Knesset. You've diverted your attention to something else, the youth group meeting, which is going to be on Wednesday evening, or whatever the schedule happens to be. Now, according to the sources we've seen, synagogue demands this kind of respect. Synagogue demands this kind of honor and dignity. I realize full well, indeed the Mishnah Berurah himself realizes full well, that it's more or less impossible to live up to these standards. After all, the Mishnah Berurah says the Arizal, the greatest of the rabbis of the 16th century, one of the all-time great mystics, one of the all-time great rabbis, he was able to live up to these standards. I mean, Mishnah Berurah understands perfectly that ordinary people have difficulty living up to these standards, but it's a standard to strive for. That's in the Beit Knesset. Outside of the Beit Knesset, it follows, therefore, that all is well, and you could direct your attention as you like. Are the announcements permitted after the services? Well, of course they are, and one should be, in any practical situation, one should of course be directed, one should of course be advised and instructed by the local Rav of the synagogue. After all, it's the local Rav of the synagogue who is the captain of the ship, and it's the local Rav of the synagogue who has to figure out what's ultimately best for his community, and there are a ton of considerations which go into making these decisions, and the Rav of the local community, who knows what the needs of the local community are, he's the one who's in a position to make these decisions for each individual synagogue. One should of course be directed, one should of course consult with the local Rav about these issues. Yeah, what happens if the people are engaging in frivolous discussion in the Beit Knesset, and I do not wish to participate in the frivolous discussion? Am I going to be guilty of insulting them? As far as this is concerned, the Mishnah Berurah himself speaks at great length about whether or not one is guilty of a violation of Torah if you insult people by refusing to participate in their frivolous activity. If you refuse to participate in their frivolous activity and this causes them to be offended, you are not guilty. You are not guilty of offending them. It's not your fault that they feel offended, because you are behaving in a correct way. It's true that you are ignoring them. As we said before, kavod, honor, respect means paying attention to them. Zilzul, disrespect, dishonor means diverting your attention from something or from some person. It's true that you're directing your attention away from them and ignoring them, and under normal circumstances that would indeed qualify as a disrespect, as an insult. However, if the reason you are disregarding them is because they're engaged in activity which is simply wrong, then what you should do is disregard them. Let me just point out in passing that this idea is true and correct if what they are doing is truly prohibited. If, on the other hand, I wish to disregard them, I wish to disrespect them and insult them by ignoring them, not because of something which is truly a halachic requirement, but because it's something which is only my chumrah, my strict behavior above and beyond what halacha requires. Well, if it's not truly a halachic requirement, then of course I'm not allowed to insult them. I'm not allowed to disrespect them by ignoring them. If it's only because I want to follow some strict, extra pious opinion, that's not justification for ignoring them. If what they're doing is truly prohibited and not just a question of being strict above and beyond what halacha demands, if what they're doing is truly prohibited, then of course I do not want to be involved with their activities. And if they're going to be offended, it's not my problem that they're doing something wrong, it's their problem. Are you allowed to tell others to lower their voices, assuming that there's some reasonable expectation that they will listen to you? Yes. The idea is as follows. Let's get this spelled correctly on chat. Mutav shihu shogegim. It's always better that someone be a sinner, b'shogeg. It's always better that someone commit a sin unwittingly, unknowingly, rather than being mazed, a wanton violator of halacha. And therefore, telling someone, shaking one's finger at someone and telling him you are guilty of a halachic violation and you should not be doing what you're doing, if you're just going to change them from a shogeg, an ignorant violator, into a knowing violator of halacha, you've just made the situation worse, and it would have been better to remain silent. If, on the other hand, there's some reasonable expectation that they will listen to you, then indeed it's correct to shake your finger and tell them you should be quiet in the synagogue and not have your idle conversation. Each case will have to be judged on its own merits. This rule applies not only to shushing people, telling people to be quiet in the Beit Knesset. Same rule applies throughout the length and breadth of Torah. If someone is doing something wrong, is it correct to instruct him? Is it correct to instruct her that you're doing something wrong and you should be doing it in a different way? If there's some reasonable expectation that they're going to listen to you, then of course, you should instruct them about the correct Torah way to do things. If there's no reasonable expectation they're going to listen to you, it's better to be silent and not run the risk of changing them into mizidim. Saying aliyot between saying tehillim between aliyot might be in many situations an excellent way to solve the problem. Yes, asking them to lower their voices if there's some reasonable expectation that they'll listen to you, go for it. Okay. Now we know that in the synagogue, idle conversation, innocent conversation, is wrong. I understand, and the Mishnah Brura already understood, that most people have difficulty living up to this standard, this ultimate standard, but it's the Arizal was successful in completely avoiding idle chatter in the Beit Knesset, but it's a goal to strive for. What about outside the Beit Knesset? Let's now talk about idle chatter, innocent conversation outside of the Beit Knesset in your general activities all day long. This is the text of the Shulchan Aruch. Not correct. This is the text of the Aruch HaShulchan. As you know, the Aruch HaShulchan is one of my favorite works. Well, it's one of the great halachic works of the 20th century, around 100 years ago. He says, Yesh Litmoa. It's amazing. It's surprising. It's surprising that nowadays we hear people who are otherwise perfectly Torah observant. We hear Torah observant people engaging in conversations in the synagogue. We hear it all the time. It's very, very common. Ahar hatfila, They have conversations after the prayers. They discuss frivolous, secular matters after the davening amongst themselves, and they seem to think it's entirely permitted. And it's amazing, why do they think it's permitted to engage in secular discussions at any time in the synagogue? Nearly, it seems to me, it seems to me that the people who are lenient and engaging in secular discussions in the synagogue have the following line of thought. Kashitas Ramban. They must be basing their practice on what the Ramban said. What did the Ramban say? The Ramban said, Batei Knesiot Shel Bavel. All of the synagogues outside of Eretz Yisrael, he says Babylonia, but that means every place outside of Eretz Yisrael. All the synagogues outside of Eretz Yisrael were built al Tanai, were built with a condition built in to the synagogue. Afilu b'yishuvan mutar l'daber shemuchrachim l'chach. When they built the synagogue, when they opened up the synagogue, it was built and opened up to the public with the condition that secular, innocent, frivolous conversation should be permitted. And people seem to think it's necessary to engage in these conversations in the synagogue. Everyone has a different subject he or she wants to discuss in the synagogue. They must be following the thinking of the Ramban, that just as we mentioned last week, a synagogue can be built with a condition in the building of the synagogue that eating be permitted there. Similarly, a synagogue can be built with a condition that innocent conversation be permitted there. And according to the Ramban, this is standard procedure in every synagogue outside of Eretz Yisrael. And it must be that that's what the people are relying upon. The Aruch HaShulchan concludes as follows. Zevadai, what is surely correct, speaking on frivolous matters, speaking on secular matters, innocent conversation, maybe they are relying on the Ramban, maybe there's a source to rely upon, maybe, but what is surely correct in the Beit Knesset, what is surely correct is la'ashen, to smoke, sham, to smoke there in the synagogue, alim hamururim, the bitter leaves, kanahug, like people do, laha'alot sham, to produce smoke in the Beit Knesset. Now, he's talking about a bizarre practice. Trust me on this. I know about it because I read about it in the New York Times. There are people who take the leaf of the tobacco plant. They cure the leaves they ferment the leaves of the tobacco plant, dry them, shred them, burn them, and breathe in the smoke. As absurd as this might sound, as bizarre as this might sound, there are people who are actually doing this, but in the synagogue, surely it is prohibited. Vadai, certainly, Isur Gomur, it's entirely prohibited to do this in the synagogue. Ein lacha kalus rosh gadol mizeh, there's nothing more frivolous than that. Lo hutra rak liyoshvim v'lomdim sham kol hayom. The only people who are allowed to smoke in the Beis HaMidrash, the only people who are allowed to smoke in the center of learning are the people who are sitting there all day long learning, just as they are allowed to eat there, because this is where they are all day long. Similarly, they are allowed to smoke there. Chatziyom, even if they're learning half a day in the Beis Midrash, that's enough to permit them to smoke there. Zeo ka'achila etzlam, for people who are there the full day, or at least half a day, for them, smoking is like eating. Just as we would permit them to eat, we can permit them to smoke. Lachein mutar lehem b'veit HaMidrash, they're allowed to smoke in the Beis HaMidrash, in the learning center, if they are there at least for half a day. but not in the synagogue. Shar kol adam, everyone else, is not allowed to smoke even in the center of learning. It's impossible to permit smoking in the synagogue. There's absolutely no basis for that. Lachein, therefore, ro'ui ligor ba'osim kein, therefore it is correct to shake your finger and tell the people who are smoking in the synagogue that they're doing something wrong and they should stop. Now, this idea of the Aruch HaShulchan has a history to it. As recently as when I moved into my holy neighborhood here in Jerusalem, as you know, I live in a neighborhood which is wall-to-wall Haredim. As recently as when I moved into my neighborhood 30 years ago, the synagogue was full of cigarette smoke on Yom Tov. And on Yom Tov, you're allowed to use fire, and therefore on Yom Tov, the people were smoking, and the synagogue was full of cigarette smoke on Yom Tov. I personally find cigarette smoke revolting, and therefore I was, on Yom Tov, I would just stand outside by the window because I couldn't stand the smoke inside. In the course of time, now 30 years later, there still are smokers. Unfortunately, there's still plenty of smokers in the neighborhood. Indeed, people like me are terribly upset that there are even young smokers in the neighborhood, but at least not in the synagogue. When I was a young whippersnapper, just whipping and snapping all over the town, I was a student in the Mir Yeshiva. The Mir Yeshiva is one of the big yeshivas here in Yerushalayim. It's the biggest yeshiva in Yerushalayim today. Back then it wasn't so big. But by 11 o'clock in the morning, the study hall, the Beis Midrash, was so full of smoke that you could barely see from one side of the room to the other. I remember they had an exhaust fan up on the wall, very near the ceiling, and if you would stand outside and watch the air being exhausted from the Beis Midrash, there'd be a constant column of smoke just constantly coming out of the Beis Midrash from the exhaust fan. The people were smoking like crazy in the synagogue back in those days for various reasons. Not only because I find the smoke revolting, but also health considerations. For various reasons, I was very upset about this. It bothered me greatly. Back in those days, talking about 30 years ago, more 40 years ago, a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, a handwritten tshuva, which he wrote back in those days, fell into my hands. A tshuva in which Rav Moshe Feinstein made the following point very clearly. He said that even those who hold that smoking is permitted, and there are great poskim who hold that it's permitted, it's a controversial matter among the poskim, even those poskim who hold that smoking cigarettes is permitted, even they agree that in a public place like the Beis Midrash, the study hall, it is prohibited to smoke if one person is bothered by the smoke. If there's at least one person who is bothered by the smoke, it is prohibited to smoke in the public place where at least one person will be bothered by it. Well, this handwritten tshuva, written by Rav Moshe Feinstein, I typed up the text very nicely. I went to a printer and I had the original handwritten tshuva photographed and my printed version, typewritten version photographed. I had them printed up side by side. And I made a large number of copies and put them on bulletin boards on synagogues all over Yerushalayim. And over the next year or so, well, it took actually 2 or 3 years, the rate of smoking steadily declined. And today, there's no smoking at all in the study halls, in the Batei Midrash in Yerushalayim. I'd like to take credit for the whole thing. Well, maybe I'm just being prideful there, but maybe I had some influence in making that happen. Smoking is surely an expression of disrespect, that is, the opposite of tzumet lev, the opposite of paying attention to the sanctity of the place. It's a disregard of the sanctity of the place, and therefore even those who permit smoking in general, and there are such poskim, even those who permit smoking in general, not in the Beis HaMidrash, not in the Beit Knesset, and not in any public place where there's even just one person who is bothered by the smoke. Let me just point out, for completeness, for the sake of completeness, let me point out that the first of the great poskim to prohibit smoking altogether was none other than the Mishnah Brura himself. The Mishnah Brura, talking about the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, the Mishnah Brura wrote, everyone who smokes knows that smoking is injurious to health. Anyone who smokes knows that he or she cannot walk up a flight of steps without getting out of breath. Everyone knows that it's injurious to health. He wrote this at the end of the 19th century, and therefore smoking is a simple violation of Nishmatem Od L'Nafsha Seichem, a simple violation of the Torah imperative to maintain our health. The first of the great poskim to prohibit smoking was the Chafetz Chaim. Today, it's commonplace. Today, just about all of the great poskim prohibit it. Not much of machlokas left on that, although the lenient opinion still does exist. Let's go one step further. It says in the Shulchan Aruch, "Mutar larutz kishaholech lebeit knesset." Although in general, the Gemara and the Zohar are both very much against running. There's something undignified about running. Walking peacefully is a more dignified way of getting from one place to another. Running is undignified, but the Gemara and the Zohar agree that if you are running to do a mitzvah, that's okay, because if you're running to do a mitzvah, that is paying attention. That's showing that your attention is focused on the performance of the mitzvah, and that's what kavod, that's what honor and respect is all about, and therefore it is permitted to run to the Beit Knesset. V'chein l'chol dvar mitzvah, running to do any mitzvah is correct. Now, as far as jogging for health is concerned, that's a whole different issue, which we're going to come to in, I think, 2 weeks. We'll come to the issue of jogging for health. We're not ready for that. We're talking just about running to get someplace in general being a disrespectful way of walking in the public domain. Now, in the Shulchan Aruch, it says you're allowed to run to the synagogue. Yeah. If the lemon spray bothers someone uses lemon spray because of an allergy in the synagogue, the smell spreads everywhere. I hope it's a pleasant smell, but if one person finds the smell offensive, I suppose it's quite possible for someone to find lemon smell offensive. If one person finds it offensive, the rule is always it's the offender who must go away, not the offended. If you have 100 smokers in the 100 smokers in the Beis HaMidrash, 100 smokers in the center of learning, and one person who finds the smoke repulsive, it's the 100 smokers, it's the offenders who must go away and find some other place to learn. It's not the offended, not the person who finds it offensive who has to leave. But lemon spray strikes me as being fairly innocent. So maybe there are people who find it offensive. I don't know. The facts will have to be established. Shulchan Aruch says you can run to the synagogue. Mishnah Brura therefore concludes that means ad petach Beit Knesset, until you get to the doorway. You can run up to the doorway of the synagogue. In the synagogue itself, you're not allowed to run. You have to walk in a proper, correct way. It's undignified to run in the Beit Knesset. You can run to the Beit Knesset because you're running to do a mitzvah, but in the Beit Knesset, one should conduct oneself in a mechubed, in a dignified way. Let us understand what we have up till this point. Up to this point, we know that in the synagogue, a place which demands respect, namely focusing one's attention entirely on the kedusha of the place, anything which will divert your attention from the kedusha, the sanctity of the Beit Knesset, is wrong, whether it be a conversation with your friend about the weather or reading a chapter of Dostoevsky, anything which is going to divert your attention from the kedusha of the Beit Knesset is wrong. If it means if you're going to be programming on your computer, if you're going to be practicing the violin, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's a diversion of attention from the sanctity of the presence of God in the synagogue, it's wrong. Outside of the Beit Knesset, there's no objection to all of these activities, of course. Only in the Beit Knesset, they're wrong. Now, with this, we're going to turn to a big and important issue. We have time today to introduce this next big issue. The next big issue is reading secular literature. Is there room in Torah thought for reading secular literature, whether it be Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, or the latest thriller? Is there room to permit reading? Is there room to smile? Is there room to smile upon people who read secular literature? No. We're going to see what the sources have to say about secular literature. After that, we'll turn to all kinds of games like chess and ping pong, but we're not ready for chess and ping pong yet. We're first talking about secular literature. Let's see what the Shulchan Aruch has to say about that. We're quoting now from the Shulchan Aruch itself. The Shulchan Aruch is talking in the context of Shabbat. On Shabbat, militot, stories, mishalim, parables, shasichat chulin, secular literature, divrei cheshek, love stories, secular literature or love stories. Kagon, for example, Sefer Emmanuel. For example, the Sefer Emmanuel, if you're interested in the Sefer Emmanuel, which the Shulchan Aruch is about to say very bad things about it, here you have a link which will tell you all about Sefer Emmanuel, the book which the Shulchan Aruch is about to say very bad things about. Let's see what the Shulchan Aruch says. Sefer Emmanuel, a love story. Nachein Sifrei Milchamot, or history books about wars. It's a secular literature, history book about wars. There are plenty of history books out there about wars, and people enjoy reading about wars. All of this secular literature, asur lekrot behem b'Shabbat. You're not allowed to read any secular literature on Shabbat. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. No Shakespeare, no Dostoevsky, surely not the latest thriller, and surely not any love story. All prohibited on Shabbat. If the magazine it has religious material in it, that's fine, but if it's only stories, according to the Shulchan Aruch, wrong, 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 and prohibited. Now, let me point out in passing one very important linguistic observation. In Hebrew, the word which is translated to read is likrot. I think everyone knows that the underlying meaning of likro is not to read. It does mean to read, but the underlying meaning is to call out, to speak out loud, is koreh. We today are taught in school to read silently just by moving our eyes along the text. Yeah, movies, same thing. We are taught to read just by moving our eyes along the text without moving our mouths. We are taught to read silently. The idea of silent reading is a very recent development in human culture. In antiquity and in the Middle Ages, and indeed in early modern times, there was no such thing as silent reading. Everyone read out loud and listened to himself, listened to herself read, and that's how they understood what the text is. It's only in modern, contemporary culture that we are taught to read silently. That's why in rabbinic texts, the word to read is identical to the word to call out, because there was only vocal reading back in those days. The idea of reading silently had not yet come into the world. Now, this leads many poskim, led by the Netziv, let's get that spelled correctly, the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the great Rav of Volozhin, was the first to make the following observation, and after him, many great poskim agree that what the Shulchan Aruch is prohibiting here is what the Shulchan Aruch knew about in those days, namely reading secular literature out loud on Shabbat. Le'ayen, simply putting your eyes on the text, what we would call silent reading, le'ayen, just to put your eyes on the text, what we call silent reading, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't speak about it at all. And therefore, the prohibition of the Shulchan Aruch at this point is to read secular literature, truly love stories, out loud on Shabbat. As long as the reading is silent, the Shulchan Aruch has no opinion one way or another, and therefore that's permitted. Now on Shabbat, reading out loud secular literature, according to Shulchan Aruch, prohibited. Even during the week, the Shulchan Aruch says, Asur mishum moshev leitzim. It's prohibited to read secular literature during the week because that's moshev leitzim, that's frivolous. You are joining together with people who are engaged in frivolity, useless, wasteful activity. It's useless, wasteful to read these books, and therefore you shouldn't even do it during the week. How about reading out loud for Shalom Bayis? Well, according to, we're going to see other opinions presently, but according to the opinion that reading secular literature is prohibited on Shabbos, it's simply prohibited. We're going to see other opinions, but according to the Shulchan Aruch, prohibited. Even reading a story to put the children to sleep at night on Shabbos, according to this text, prohibited. Not only prohibited on Shabbos, because that's a special Shabbos prohibition, but during the week. It's just frivolous, useless activity, and therefore wrong during the week. Over Mishum, you're guilty. If you read this literature during the week, you are guilty of Al Tifnu Ela Elilim. You're guilty of diverting your attention from God and going to engage in idolatry. That's how bad it is to read secular literature on even during the week. Lo tifnu el medatchem. Don't divert your mind from God by reading secular literature. According to this, you can't even put the children to sleep by reading Goldilocks or Mother Goose during the week, because that would be a diversion from attention to God. That would be idolatrous. Pretty serious stuff. Divrei Cheshek, love stories. Ikabotu mishum negari yetzahara. Love stories are even worse because they have the additional prohibition of stimulating the yetzahara and will lead you into temptation. Misha Chibran, Misha Ha'atikan, those who wrote these books, the authors. Misha Ha'atikan, the scribes who copied these books. Back in those days, there was no printing, right? The scribes who copied these books. Ein Sarich Lomar Hamad Pisim. Surely nowadays, those who print these books, Machtiim et Arabim, they're all guilty of causing the public to sin. The people who wrote the book are causing the people to sin. The people who copied the book, who published the book, who printed the book, they're all guilty of causing the public to sin. These books are just usser, totally prohibited. Well, this is a very strongly formulated position. And we have, now at the end of our hour, we're going to pause with this cliffhanger. We've seen now the strict position. We're going to have to wait until next week. Well, you can look ahead in the sources because they've been distributed to you. Next week, we'll see what other poskim have to say on this issue, and we'll see if we can come to some conclusions about having fun by reading secular literature during the week and or on Shabbos. We'll come to conclusions next week. Until then, I wish you a good week and a Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you next week. Shalom, shalom.